I think we all know how the story ends. All of America's top federal authorities find no evidence of collusion or conspiracy. There was no client list, no blackmail, nothing left behind at all. The banker who spent his career building a mysterious fortune while he managed money for billionaire clients that probably didn't exist, while also trafficking girls to and from a private island in the Caribbean at the same time as he hosted some of the world's foremost politicians, businessmen, intellectuals, and celebrities as house guests, he had acted completely alone. It was all an unfortunate coincidence and nothing more. The story of Jeffrey Epstein faded into the past as the world kept turning.
Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein?
Or at least that's what the story would have been if there weren't already mountains and mountains of evidence of Epstein being not just a psychopath, but also at the center of a crime ring that involved the world's most powerful people, procuring victims for them to abuse together. Even now, with the federal government conflicting themselves and going back on their word in regards to his case, the controversy and mystery around Jeffrey Epstein has reached a fever pitch. Silence doesn't make it go away. It's only made the questions grow louder as people's trust in our leadership is turning to dust. But in order to understand how Jeffrey Epstein was allowed to happen, what made him the monster he was, we have to go all the way back to the beginning, before the island, before the fortunes, before the world knew his name, and we have to take a much closer look at his life and the system that enabled him. Jeffrey Epstein first appears in any public capacity in July of 1980, when he's 27 years old. But the context is very strange. There's an article I found from Cosmopolitan magazine where he was listed as Bachelor of the Month with a tiny blurb and a black and white photo next to it. It says, financial strategist Jeffrey Epstein talks only to people who make over $1 million a year. If you're a cute Texas girl, write this New York dynamo at 55 Water Street, 49th floor, New York, blah, blah, blah. Because for the first 20 years of his career, Epstein garnered only occasional and brief mentions in the press. He had no real public recognition at all in the way that most high-level bankers might. That's because there wasn't really a sensible explanation as to how he got there in the first place. Jeffrey Edward Epstein, born in Brooklyn in 1953, was the son of two working-class Jewish parents who, by all accounts, were completely normal. His mother, Pauline, worked a full-time job as a teacher's assistant while raising the kids, and his father worked for the City of New York's Parks Department as a gardener. Former friends and neighbors would use words like simple, humble, and gentle when talking about Epstein's parents, his brothers, and even Jeffrey himself. One former neighbor would later write that he was a nerdy little boy. People said that he was smart, overweight, always smiling, but mostly quiet. In high school, Epstein liked algebra and calculus, and he was on the math team, but his teammates would later describe him as not sticking out all that much. But he was smart enough to graduate high school in 1969, 2 years early, and he would then attend Cooper Union College, a very small school in Manhattan known for offering completely free tuition. He studied math there, although after 2 years he transferred to NYU, but he ended up leaving there after 3 years without any college degree at all. But within 2 months, Epstein had picked up a full-time job anyway. He had become a high school math teacher, not just at any school, but at one of the most prestigious in Manhattan, a school for the children of the elites. The students were the children of highly paid bankers, developers, politicians, people that could afford to pay a tuition equal to $50,000 a year today. By the time he started teaching at Dalton, Epstein was almost a completely different person. Basically, as a teacher, Jeffrey Epstein was a sleazy scumbag and a bit of a disaster. In the mid-1970s, students at one of New York's most esteemed prep schools were surprised to encounter a new teacher who pushed the limits of the school's strict dress code, wandering the halls in a fur coat, gold chains, and an open shirt that exposed his chest. But it wasn't just a willingness to dress provocatively, it was how he interacted with students that left an impression on many of them for decades after. He was apparently popular among female students, as many young teachers might be, but the problem was that he not only embraced the attention, but also seemed to have chased after it. The story goes that at one point, he even started showing up at students' parties, including ones where they would have been drinking underage. But before this private school teacher in his mid-20s could ever get involved in something that might implicate him in a serious way, Epstein was fired from the Dalton School for performance issues. He simply wasn't a good teacher. But at the same time, though, he was able to move his career in a way that I could only describe as failing upwards. Because if you fast forward about 20 years, Epstein was no longer this sort of aimless college dropout who had a reputation for being a bit of a creep towards students at the school he worked at. It was almost as if Epstein would go on to become a completely, literally different person. When you look deeper at how exactly Epstein goes from this disgraced school teacher to flying a jetliner around the world while he rubs elbows with the rich and famous, the puzzle pieces don't really fit together. It would only be a few months after getting fired from the Dalton School in 1976 until Epstein found another job. Specifically, he got hired at the giant investment firm Bear Stearns as an assistant to a floor trader. And it's the second time he did that in just a couple of years. Because if he did do one thing right while working at Dalton, it was impress his students' rich and powerful parents. Specifically, he was hired off the recommendation of a student's parent he had impressed who also happened to be friends with Alan Greenberg, CEO of the bajillion-dollar Bear Stearns investment bank. Greenberg was also known for coming from a working-class background, and he liked to hire people with what he called PSD degrees: poor, smart, and desperate to be rich. Whether or not getting his foot in the door was his original goal while working at a private school, whatever it was, Epstein had launched himself up the ladder in a massive way. And it's kind of weird, but Epstein's time at this giant financial services firm, it wasn't all that different from his time as a teacher. Within just 4 years there, he gets promoted from junior assistant to limited partner, which is a pretty crazy trajectory for someone with no college degree. But then, just a year after that, he was actually asked to quit or be fired during an SEC investigation into insider trading at Bear Stearns. But for the rest of the 1980s, he would start or get involved in a strange series of businesses that, if we didn't know they existed, kind of sound made up. Probably the strangest out of everything he did during this time was Towers Financial Corporation, a collection agency that was in the business of buying consumer medical debt. While he was hired as a consultant and paid the equivalent of $69,000 a month today, the first job he was given was to start using the company as a raiding vessel for corporate takeovers. In the 80s, there was this popular practice of buying a large stake in a corporation, then firing top executives, and then downsizing even further to increase the share value before selling. Basically, you take over and ruin a company just to make money from it. And their first move was to attempt a takeover of a kind of old, declining airline, Pan American World Airways, in 1987. A year later, they also tried to take over Emory Air Freight. And while both attempts failed, that wasn't the problem. The problem is that they were using money they didn't actually have. Basically, while this company was claiming to be a debt collection agency, they had also raised $500 million from investors while promising big returns. They used the money on private jets, fancy houses, expensive cars, and their plan for paying it all back was to attempt those crazy corporate takeovers that were supposed to make enough profit to cover everything. But then when the takeovers failed, they had nowhere to turn, no money to repay the investors, and it all fell apart. And so in 1993, Towers Financial would implode after being exposed as one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in American history. But when it came time for his former business partner, Stephen Hoffenberg, to be deposed and tell his side of the story in court, he didn't just throw Epstein under the bus, he basically blamed the whole thing on him. But by the time the company collapsed and was being investigated, Epstein had already been gone for 3 years. He would never be charged with anything related to Towers Financial. Meanwhile, his business partner Hoffenberg, he would spend nearly 20 years in prison. I don't think we have an exact reason why Epstein was never charged for being on the inside of one of the biggest Ponzi schemes ever. One explanation is that Hoffenberg could have been lying. His testimony during his case was considered kind of generally unreliable. He would lie about a lot of stuff, wouldn't tell the truth. Another reason is that if Epstein was never really on the record as being deeply involved in the fraud, because apparently they didn't use his name for the trades or whatever it was, it's just hearsay. You know, we can't really prove that he's involved in the scam, so it's not worth pursuing if they did have Hoffenberg right in front of them and they could just punish him. However, another person would later write that it was only because of lazy prosecution that Epstein walked away and that he was definitely involved as far as anyone can tell. Especially because it's well recorded that during the peak of the Towers Financial scam, Epstein was physically accompanying Hoffenberg around the world on his jet. He was meeting with investors. He was with him a lot of the time. And that's because somehow, after walking away from a moderately high-paying consultant job and apparently having nothing to do with the hundreds of millions of dirty money they made, he somehow pops up again a couple years later, completely reinvented, like his old self never existed at all. But the idea that Epstein's career is just kind of a story about failing upwards, like I mentioned earlier, that doesn't even really explain how he ends up where he did. Yeah, a teacher at a rich private school might get hired by one of his students' rich parents, okay? But 15 years later, walking away unscathed from one of the worst financial crimes in American history, I mean, seriously, most of us probably don't remember, but Towers Financial was absolutely horrible. Even back at that point in his life, a lot of his situations sound like a conspiracy. But of course, that's only one of these really odd stories that have been told about Epstein's careers over the years that imply all these different truths about how he ended up where he did. Multiple people over the years, journalists, friends, business partners, they all recalled Epstein suggesting or hinting that he worked for an intelligence agency, although he never specified which one. But in the mid to late 80s, during the same time he was working at Towers Financial, he also worked with Adnan Khashoggi, the Saudi businessman with ties to the CIA and Mossad, who was best known for being the middleman in transferring American weapons from Israel to Iran during the Iran-Contra affair. Add on to that the fact that Epstein was later found to have a fake Austrian passport with multiple stamps from the Middle East. It only further paints a very confusing picture about Epstein's career. There just isn't a normal, sensible conclusion to this part of Epstein's life. Even after connecting all the dots, it still doesn't make sense. He starts off by dropping out of college without getting his degree, only to get hired at a prestigious school that he then gets fired from for being a bad teacher, only to then get hired at a hugely prestigious investment firm that he also then gets fired from, only to then end up getting implicated in one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in American history that he somehow never faces a single charge for being involved in. Along the way, he acquires fake passports, he does business with arms dealers in the Middle East, and at the end of all of it, he's filthy rich. At every single turn, you see him get not punished, but actually rewarded for stealing, cheating, and lying. But the craziest part of all of that is that that was just the beginning. In the late 80s, Epstein forms a new company, Epstein & Co., a wealth management firm where he establishes immediately that he's not going to take any clients with a net worth of under $1 billion. It was around the time that Epstein launched Epstein & Co., his investment services company, that his life kind of just seems to completely change all over again for what feels like the 100th time in a row. By the early 90s, he's moving like someone who's in charge of an empire. He's flying around the world in a giant jetliner, he's acquiring massive properties around the US, but at the same time, his name never shows up in Forbes. He has no public filings, no client list, no office, but to the people around him, it looks like he owns the world. By the late 90s, Epstein's doing what I could only describe as flying too close to the sun. He's friends with Donald Trump, the Prince of England, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He even buys a literal island where he would build an extravagant compound for hosting parties. But after a series of conspicuous stunts, one of which was a trip to Africa on his private plane with Bill Clinton and Kevin Spacey as passengers, it gets to a point where Epstein is too big to ignore. The media, the general public, people are wondering how Epstein made all this money, where he came from, what's the point of everything he does. How he got to this level of social status is yet another strange story in this never-ending list of strange stories. And a big part of it would be this very, very strange story of his connection to the Maxwell family media empire. Robert Maxwell was born Ian Ludovic Hyman Benjamin Hawke. He was a media tycoon businessman with a really strange life. After the war, he changes his name to Robert Maxwell, moves to England, and gets elected into the British Parliament. But he also quickly starts building a media empire across Europe at the same time. Over a period of around 50 years, he ends up owning the Daily Mirror, he owns part of MTV in Europe, the London Daily News. At one point, he even buys the US-based Macmillan Publishers for over $2 billion in the late 80s. But throughout his life, he was also closely linked to Israeli intelligence. Point being, though, is that one of Robert Maxwell's 9 children, Ghislaine, had long been a prominent socialite in London and New York. And after her father died and the family empire collapses in the early 90s, she ends up living in Manhattan, where she would end up dating none other than Jeffrey Epstein. Notably, Ghislaine, the daughter of this internationally known billionaire spy for Israel, would become the primary link between Epstein and his powerful social network. Out of many things she would do for him, she would be the person who introduces him to Prince Andrew, Saudi royals, celebrities, politicians. Of course, Epstein was already pretty well connected, but his relationship with Maxwell was pivotal in him inserting himself into the upper echelon of society. In March of 2003, Vanity Fair journalist Vicky Ward sets out to write a profile about Jeffrey Epstein and figure out what exactly he's all about once and for all. Lately, Jeffrey Epstein's high-flying style has been drawing oohs and ahs. The bachelor financier lives in New York's largest private residence, claims to only take billionaires as clients, and flies celebrities like Bill Clinton and Kevin Spacey on his Boeing 727. But Pierce's air of mystery and the picture changes. And her point was that, after peeling back his mask of mystery, something far more alarming than anticipated would be revealed. Her research led her to question the idea that Epstein made all of his money with an exclusive and private investment firm where he'd only take on billionaires as clients. She suggests that Leslie Wexner is the only client Epstein ever had, but even more than that his business isn't really how he made his money at all. What she found made it look like Epstein really wasn't a genius investor at all, but probably acquired the majority of his mysterious fortune from the Tower's financial Ponzi scheme, which he was far more involved in than the official story would suggest. She essentially made him look like a fraud, a con man with no substantial investing history, hiding behind the persona of an elite financial mastermind while building up a social network to make him look a lot more sophisticated than he really was. Even worse than what they did publish about him is what they didn't.